Awesome. Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone. So I am a research psychologist, so that's the lens that I'm bringing to the table today. In particular, I am helping to build a new field called health neuroscience. And this is a field that really looks at the way, our main goal here is to look at the way the brain affects and is affected by health behaviors. And today I'm going to be talking about the impact of exercise, and this is a particularly promising health behavior on human brain structure and function. So the field of health neuroscience has really emerged at a good time because we are aging, not only in the U.S., but also globally. So these lines here represent the general trend in developing countries or developed countries across the world, and that the proportion of older adults is far outnumbering that of young children. And while this is good in some ways, it's a testament to modern healthcare and the fact that life expectancy is going up, this is also going to present some economic and social challenges. And this is because many chronic and costly conditions, things like diabetes and heart disease, incidence of stroke, as well as Alzheimer's and dementia, increase in prevalence as we age. And what's even more troubling is that these diseases are not curable right now, and they cause decreases in independence and quality of life in our older adults. So in fact, when you ask people what scares them the most about aging, the number one concern reported about getting older is declining mental capacity. So people are very afraid of becoming cognitively incapacitated as they age. This concern is not completely unfounded. So here are 6 different domains of cognitive function, and these are kind of average trajectories. And as you can see, the general theme is that of decline over adulthood, particularly starting in around the 4th decade. However, what you can't see by looking at these group-level averages, and something that has me hooked on cognitive aging research, is that when you look at the individuals that make up any one of these lines, we see an incredible amount of variability. So much so that you can take 2 people of roughly the same age. So here we're looking at speed of processing. We're zeroing in on that top line that's the steepest declining. You can take individuals of roughly the same age, and you see that some people, like this person circled in green, are performing like someone decades younger, whereas this person, roughly the same age, is performing like someone decades older. So a key question we ask is, what explains this green person's performance? Are they just genetically lucky, or have they done something throughout their life that enables them to age in this more successful way? So this pattern of inter-individual variability is also mirrored in the brain too. So here I'm showing 2 brain regions, the hippocampus in red and the prefrontal cortex in blue. And these brain changes may even precede the changes that we see in cognition, and we see the same pattern of inter-individual variability. So people roughly the same age are showing vastly different brain volumes, gray matter volumes in these regions. And the same question applies: is there anything that we can do to end up more like the green person instead of the person in red? So there are many strategies. There's a lot of advice out there for how we can maximize our own chances of aging successfully. But the one that has by far the most scientific evidence behind it, and the one I'm going to be focusing on today, is physical activity. So I'm going to try to convince you through several lines of evidence that you should invest your precious time and your precious money in your physical fitness to preserve your cognitive health. So with that framework in mind, here are the questions that are guiding the rest of my talk. So first, how does physical activity and fitness relate to brain structure? How do these things relate to brain function? What are the effects of a randomized exercise intervention on brain volume? And then finally, what are the consequences of physical activity behavior on long-term cognitive functioning? So first, how does physical activity and fitness relate to brain structure? So a lot of our work on the brain centers on the hippocampus. In a nutshell, this is because the hippocampus from animal work is shown to be highly sensitive to environmental enrichment, so things like exercise. And it also is a brain region that we know shows neurogenesis throughout the lifespan. The foundational human evidence for this comes from a cross-sectional study by Erickson and colleagues in 2009. So just the general design of this study was they had 165 sedentary older adults, roughly between 60 and 80 years old. They were adjudicated to be free of dementia. They completed spatial memory assessment in the lab, as well as an aerobic fitness assessment. This is VO2 max. And then they also completed a structural MRI scan, which allowed for the volumetric assessment of the hippocampal formation. And here's what they found. Higher fitness was associated with larger volumes of the hippocampus. And this association wasn't just meaningless. So he also found that hippocampal volume mediated the relationship between fitness and better spatial memory performance. So since the study was published, this general fact that higher fitness is related to larger hippocampal volume has been replicated across many different populations. So on the left here, I'm showing that this effect is in children. So instead of a scatter plot, Chaddock and colleagues split into these children into lower fit and higher fit. But again, the general pattern is the same. The higher fit kids are showing greater brain volume in the hippocampus. And on the right are adolescent males, and we see a very similar relationship. I'm not showing that this has also been replicated in other populations of healthy older adults as well as middle-aged adults. And you don't even have to be healthy to experience these effects. So here I'm showing the relationship on the top between greater fitness and preserved brain volume in Alzheimer's disease patients, as well as on the bottom in breast cancer survivors. So one question that arises from this research linking fitness to hippocampal structure is whether there are differences in fitness-related brain function that aren't linked, that aren't tied to these fitness-related differences in volume. Another open question is whether there's an optimal age at which physical activity is driving these effects. So for example, are the effects of physical activity stronger or only detectable later in the lifespan when the brain is undergoing some degree of atrophy or is more sensitive, or maybe early childhood when the brain is still developing? So to kind of get at some of these questions, in this study we examined associations in young adult samples, so much younger than those we traditionally test. And we had 50 young adults in this study. They completed an aerobic fitness assessment for us, again, VO2 max. I'm getting a little feedback. They also completed a structural MRI assessment, which allowed us to analyze both volumetric data as well as resting state data. And a note about the volumetric data, we created hippocampal seeds, and we split the hippocampus into anterior and posterior divisions. So a note about this is that to do this, we use an automated segmentation algorithm that takes the size and the shape of the hippocampus and then splits the structure based on its center of gravity. There are definitely more sophisticated ways to do this now. This particular data set didn't have the resolution. So we've used this more simplistic approach in the past with great success, but just keep in mind that the more sophisticated algorithms might even be more sensitive to the effects I'm going to show you. So here's what we found. First, hippocampal volume was correlated with fitness. This effect was significant on the left, only reached trend level on the right. And we also found that when we use the anterior and posterior hippocampus as seeds, higher fitness is associated with stronger functional connectivity of the anterior hippocampus with frontal and parietal regions. So as a side note here, it's pretty interesting, or we thought it was interesting, that even though we didn't see a relationship between fitness and volume of the right anterior hippocampus, we are seeing functional connectivity associations for this seed. So it is sensitive. Maybe functional connectivity is a little bit more sensitive even than volume. And I should also mention that we're controlling for volume in these functional connectivity associations. So all of the work I've discussed so far has been cross-sectional in nature. So this naturally leads to the question of whether it's possible, can we actually intervene and increase physical activity behaviors and actually change cognitive and brain aging trajectories? And of course, the best way to do this is through a randomized controlled trial. So I'm just going to quickly walk through the basic design of an RCT of exercise in our lab. So we take older sedentary adults typically, and the idea being that we want to intervene with people that need it the most. They come into the lab and complete several baseline assessments for us. So typically a fitness session, an MRI session, some cognitive testing, and some of our studies even multiple days of cognitive testing, and a blood draw for blood biomarkers. They're then randomized into one of a couple of groups. One is brisk walking, and one is stretching and toning. So those tend to be our main groups. A couple of notes about the differences between those groups. We selected them for specific reasons. So first, both groups receive physical activities. So they're physical activities, they're just different types. Both groups are receiving laboratory-based treatment in a group setting. So this is crucial to control for socialization effects. In both groups, come to the lab 3 days per week for 30 to 45 minutes. So all of them are commuting the same amount, the dose is the same. But the key difference between these groups is in the intensity and the type of physical activity. So the brisk walking group, of course, is our group of interest because it's an aerobic exercise. So after randomization to one of these groups, they partake in the intervention for 6 months up to 1 year treatment, and then they come back in and they do all of the same baseline assessments again at follow-up. So first, we generally check to see that a little manipulation check that our intervention worked. So here I'm just showing the results of a paper by Erickson and colleagues in 2011. And as you see, the walking group increased in fitness by almost 8%, whereas the stretching and toning group pretty much flatlined. So that's what we like to see. And here are the results of that study, what we typically see in the brain. So in this particular study, I'm going to start from the bottom here and work my way up on this massive figure. We typically choose a control region. So in this case, the thalamus was a control region because we weren't expecting to see any changes in volume in this region. And on the, let me orient you to the axes, the x-axis is baseline 6 months and 1 year, and volume is always on the y-axis. And you can pretty much see that the exercise and stretching groups are flatlined across the intervention. The volume is not changing. The caudate was also a control region. We see a similar pattern. Volume is, there might be a little bit of signal there, but it was not significant. Volume is pretty much flatlining across the intervention, not changing much at all. But we see something really different with this third region, the hippocampus. So not only did the control group decrease in volume over the length of the intervention, just 1 year, the exercise group actually increased in volume. So they didn't just maintain volume, they actually showed a significant increase in volume. So two take-homes from this are, first, that the older brain is plastic, and second, we can see changes in volume in this region in as little as 12 months, a few months of an intervention. So here, just showing that even though it's an intervention and we can attribute these volume changes, hopefully, to the intervention, it's always nice to see that these changes in volume in the hippocampus were correlated with changes in fitness. So it's kind of a nice link to make. And it's not just our group that's showing these effects. Here's the results of a really nice intervention. I think it was a 1 year intervention comparing 3 different intervention types. So again, a walking group, they had a coordination group, coordination training group, and another stretching and toning control group. And volume was higher at the end of the intervention in both actually the cardiovascular group and the coordination training group. So you might be wondering, that's great that you can change volume in a year, but what about the consequences of physical activity on the future cognitive functioning? So something that's behaviorally relevant. So more than just in the context of a 1 year intervention. Can we do that? And the answer is unequivocally yes. So your physical activity behavior earlier in life is associated with a reduction in your risk for cognitive impairment years later, sometimes decades later. And that figure from this meta-analysis here is right around 40 to 50%. And this is all-cause cognitive impairment. We also see this effect specific to Alzheimer's disease. So physical activity, higher levels of physical activity earlier in life is associated with a reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease. And again, that figure is hovering right around 40 to 50%, so it's like crazy consistent across these different meta-analyses. So the question arises, how are these changes between, these links between physical activity and cognitive functioning happening? We saw one mechanism, the brain mechanism, but I'm going to highlight another one. We can think of mechanisms at many different levels, and we're going to highlight a more molecular mechanism that we're looking at. So here we looked longitudinally at the relationship between physical activity and cognitive impairment much, much later. So this is a large longitudinal cohort. So we saw that using a mediation analysis, we saw that levels of a certain neuropathological peptide, beta amyloid 142, statistically mediated the link between physical activity and cognitive impairment outcome 13 years after the physical activity assessment. So just to wrap up a couple of key points from my talk, associations or higher fitness is associated with greater volume in the hippocampus. That's what I showed you, and there also is some evidence emerging that this extends to certain regions of the cortex as well, particularly the prefrontal cortex and sometimes even global brain volume. Higher fitness is associated with greater functional connectivity between the anterior hippocampus and frontal and parietal cortical regions. These associations seem to hold across children, young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults. So this, of course, suggests that physical activity's effects may extend across age groups. However, this obviously doesn't rule out the possibility that the effects are larger in some groups compared to others, something we're very interested in. Finally, randomized controlled trials of exercise help us to provide this causal evidence that physical activity can change cognition. And we're starting to identify molecular and cellular pathways in humans that underlie the effects of physical activity on brain health. And our results indicate that amyloid may be one good marker of this. So there are many open questions, many things that we still need to understand about using lifestyle behaviors like exercise to promote brain health. And I'm going to highlight a few of our biggest ones here. First, how long are the effects of exercise retained? So we are writing grants right now to follow some of our cohorts long-term to see whether they adhere to the intervention, whether we actually change the behavior, but also whether the increases in volume that we observed are maintained over time. Second, what types of exercise are most effective? So we focus on aerobic exercise, but we're also becoming very interested in things like strength training, in different forms of aerobic exercise, so maybe HIIT training, high-intensity interval training, as opposed to steady-state aerobic. What are the dose-response effects? So what we really want to know here, what everyone always asks us, is what is the bare minimum that I can do to see these effects? And we don't know that yet, and we are still working towards that. And finally, what do volumetric changes reflect on cellular level? And then finally, why do some people benefit more than others? So some of the hardest people to get into the lab for randomized controlled trials are the people that might need it the most. And so we're starting to think more about scalability and how we can get people to adhere to these interventions and actually change habits. So I just want to take my last minute or so here to highlight a study that's currently going on in our lab, the study on which I'm a co-investigator on. It's called IGNITE, which stands for Investigating Gains in Cognition in an Intervention Trial of Exercise. This is a phase 3 randomized clinical trial of 639 healthy older adults from 3 different national sites. It is a 12-month supervised exercise intervention, and here we're getting at this dose-response question. So we are looking at 2 different doses of physical activity. 150 minutes per week was chosen because that's the current U.S. physical activity guideline, and 225 minutes per week, so something significantly above the guideline. And we're comparing that to a stretching and toning control group. And we are getting a whole battery of information. It's going to be a very well-characterized cohort. We're about 3/4 of the way through data collection right now. So we will be able to answer, hopefully, some questions about moderators of who might benefit the most from exercise, as well as certain mechanisms by which exercise might change cognitive functioning and brain health. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention. I will point out that my postdoctoral mentor and now turned colleague here, Kirk Erickson, is practicing what he preaches up here, water skiing.